Hello class, Dr. Nemecek here. Welcome to week 3 of the course. This week we're going to talk about chapters 6, 7, and 8. And I made note in my announcement to you, my weekly announcement for week 3, that I want you to be aware of the fact that the information that we're going to cover in these next 3 chapters is the essence and the most important part of healthcare ethics, bar none. For anything that you're going to study in this course or what you might be able to get out of this textbook. So be aware of that as we go over Chapter 6, Ethical Frameworks, Chapter 7, Ethical Decision-Making Process, and Chapter 8, Research in Healthcare Organizations. Now the reason that I say that is because we're going to really get down to the nitty-gritty of these 3 chapters about the definitions of why ethics is so important in the healthcare industry. So much so that we're going to define it at the personal level and how it affects you as an individual and as far as your family members go, and being a provider within a healthcare organization. And it all comes in full circle too to where we talk about it in the research and biomedical industry as well, because there have been lots of mistakes made in the healthcare industry over the last 50 to 100 years that have had a severely negative impact on how we treat people and how we look at ethical handling of situations for a lot of different reasons. So what we're going to talk about in each of these chapters is how we've gotten to that point, and the textbook gives you some really good insight into that. So let's start with Chapter 6. The objectives are to appreciate the relationship between ethics and law, recognize the relationship between ethics and law using the 4-quadrant model, and be able to understand the implications of ethical awareness. So let's talk about ethical conflicts first of all. In your chapter 7, it talks about why ethical principles collide. They give you an idea of how ethical conflicts can occur and some examples of to take into consideration as to why it's important to know about. Ethical conflict is described as a broad generic term for any problem or situation that has an ethical component. And they give examples such as taking the right action when it's difficult or uncomfortable, if you have a situation that deems that as necessary, and selecting between 2 or more courses of action with each emphasizing different ethical principles. And a necessary decision between equally negative alternatives becomes obvious to you. Well, anyway, the author brings to your attention what is called the 4-quadrant model, which you can find on in Chapter 7. I'm looking for it here. I think I already passed it up. Where they talk about, Chapter 6. I'm just going to chapter ahead of myself. In Chapter 6, the 4-quadrant model is found on page 88 in your textbook. And your authors go on to tell you that this 4-quadrant model made up of quadrants 1, 2, 3, and 4, where quadrant 1 and 2 are referred to as ethical and legal things, and quadrant 3 and 4 are unethical and legal things. They go on to tell you that of the 4 quadrants, only 2 are straightforward, and that's quadrant 1 and quadrant 4. Quadrant 1 being ethical and legal, and quadrant 4 being unethical and illegal. So that tells us that the 2 in between, ethical 2 and 3, are kind of iffy situations that may be a little bit different and have to be given different considerations. So as you read through the next few pages, on page 89 of your textbook, quadrant 1, ethical and legal aspects, they talk about planning, organizing, leading and directing, and controlling, and how these things come into play relative to looking at ethical considerations. So take some time to explore the 4-quadrant approach and understand the difference between those, because this will give you a basic foundation for understanding how you can kind of compartmentalize things that may come up in your practice as a healthcare manager. You can begin to be thinking about, well, is this something that truly is ethical and not a problem for anybody? Or is it on the opposite spectrum in quadrant 4, where it is definitely an unethical situation and it's going to be a problem for somebody? Or is it in quadrant 2 or 3, where maybe it's a little bit blurry and it's not as evident to you? So to understand the 4-quadrant approach helps you to kind of organize the validity and complexity and importance of ethical decisions that need to be made by you as a healthcare manager. So again, read those all the way through page 92 in your textbook to get an understanding of how and why that information is important. The author also brings to your attention the False Claims Act, which is where you have defrauding of the federal government. This is where they talk about whistleblowers and give you examples of what healthcare managers have to deal with in that realm to make sure that you have an understanding of if you have someone come forth that identifies what they consider to be an ethical problem, you'll know what to do with it, and there are specific ways how to deal with whistleblowers that have to meet the legalities of what it is that you're dealing with. The author will also talk about in Chapter 6 the unawareness of ethical implications. And they talk about moral blindness and law fallacy. Be aware that moral blindness is a defense mechanism that people have when they have an ethical problem that occurs in front of them. They try to rationalize in their own mind that this is something that they don't have anything to do with and they don't see a problem. This is called moral blindness. They don't want to deal with it. They take the head in the sand ostrich approach where they don't believe that something needs attention. And that's a big mistake for a healthcare manager. Law fallacy. This is, as far as ethics is concerned, considered to be ideal behavior. The law itself, when talking about ethical implications, has minimum standards that define misbehavior that deserves punishment. So make sure that you're aware of ethical implications and what the law requires, because this is something that is going to help you to make the right choices and make the right decisions that are not going to have any negative impact on your ability to make the right decision for your organization or keep you protected. Now, these chapters also give us many case studies. There's one in here called the Supercharged Alcoholic Beverages, where the authors ask you after you read this mini case study what ethical principles are involved in this mini case study, specifically what laws or regulations are involved. Make sure that you read that and try to ask yourself, do the beverage companies that are involved here have an ethical duty to their stakeholders to make a profit, or do the beverage companies have an ethical duty to comply with applicable laws? Is targeting a consumer segment through marketing strategies ethical, and is it legal? Do the age or other demographics of the consumer segment affect your opinion and whether or not things are ethical or legal? And what are the ethical obligations of federal agencies when dealing with companies that are trying to push substances on people such as alcohol, which may have problems for them as far as the law is concerned? What are their legal duties, the federal agencies? So in thinking about that and thinking about what we were just talking about relative to the 4 quadrants, think about those 4 quadrants after you read this mini case study and decide where you place the actions of the beverage companies. And they specifically talk about dates that are involved there where certain things were passed in the law before and after November of 2010. So in Chapter 6, we remember these key points that will kind of bring full circle the information that we're talking about here. Ethics is the differentiation between right and wrong, irrespective of law. Laws define misconduct warranting punishment. Ethics and law are related but are not identical. The relationship between ethics and law can be categorized into 4 quadrants. Those are being ethical and legal, ethical and illegal, unethical and legal, and unethical and illegal. Healthcare managers face ethical and legal conflicts while performing their daily managerial and supervisory duties. Unawareness of the ethical implications of actions can lead to moral blindness or the law fallacy, and defaulting to legality represents a misunderstanding of ethics and the law. In other words, if you always default to the law, you are not doing your due diligence as a healthcare manager by trying to put this particular scenario of events into the 4 quadrants to make a determination as to whether or not this is really something that is ethically and legal, right or wrong. So those are the points for to remember out of Chapter 6. So spend some serious time reading all the information in that chapter. And again, this is going to really lay the groundwork for everything that we do in this course that is very important. Now, Chapter 7, the objectives in this chapter kind of carry on with the same track of thinking. But the objectives are a little bit different. In Chapter 7, we're going to be able, I want you to be able to recognize that ethical conflicts and the problems healthcare managers face will happen day in and day out. You need to be able to analyze and resolve problems using the ethical decision-making process steps, of which they're going to bring to your attention in Chapter 7. You should be able to recognize the role of ethical principles and philosophies in the decision-making process. And you should become proficient in ethical decision-making and implementing decisions. So again, starting on page 106 in Chapter 7 of your textbook, the author talks about when ethical principles collide, and he talks about different things that can happen where you've got to really be thinking about whether or not these things fall into one block of the 4 quadrants we were talking about before or not. And one of those processes that is going to really get you thinking about something of importance relative to a personal problem with a patient is they have a case from the field listed here labeled Mr. Barnes' Last Wish. This describes the ethical actions of clinicians and administrators. This case study will demonstrate the importance of following a step-by-step process in resolving ethical problems, and it will show you the role of administrators in ethical conflicts involved in the delivery of care. So please take the time to read that particular case study because it is very telling and opens your eyes relative to the kind of information we're talking about here in Chapter 7. Now, when ethical principles collide, an example of a collision is where you have medical futility and advanced healthcare directives. Weighing ethical principles in each case is going to require the determination of autonomy, beneficence, and fidelity, of which we've talked about previously in earlier chapters in the book, so you know what those definitions are. So when you're talking about weighing ethical principles, they're going to be wrapped around these 3 terms: autonomy, beneficence, and fidelity, and you'll be able to apply that to a possible example of collision, which presents an ethical dilemma. But using ethical decision-making, the process framework that they've identified for you in this chapter will help you to resolve those collisions of ethical principles and the clinical end-of-life decisions and routine business decisions that have to occur. Now, in Chapter 7, you have a couple of good charts and graphs and tables and stuff for you to take a look at. And one of them is called the Ethical Decision-Making Process Framework. I can't remember exactly what page that's on, but it talks about adopting a moral stance and then consciously selecting an ethical philosophy and then making a decision using the steps of the ethical decision-making process, where the authors tell us that to be involved with this ethical making decision process, we first have to gather the facts. We have to then differentiate ethical principles from non-moral concerns. We then need to determine the ethical drivers behind the case, conduct an ethical analysis of what's happening, select a course of action explicitly based on a philosophy, be able to act and evaluate, and then of course monitor and modify based on what it is that we have decided that we're going to do. Now, as you are moving through that information, make sure that you don't forget that also there may be some problems that you're going to encounter that are going to be referred to as decision traps and steps at risk. And the author brings to your attention things that you need to kind of understand and adopt the understanding for terms like moral blindness. This is where prior to the decision-making process, you don't recognize that an ethical implication has occurred. Again, you have to understand what law fallacy is. Prior to making a decision, you're not able to recognize that an ethical implication has occurred. So you don't recognize that this is something that's against the law, that this is a decision trap. But to avoid those types of traps, there are steps that you can take that will keep you from being at risk. And again, in the previous slide, we were talking about gathering the facts. This is where you're going to confirm evidence, and you do that by conducting an analysis, an ethical analysis, to find out what's going on. And you just kind of move through the entire steps. Again, determine the ethical drivers, conduct an ethical analysis, select a course of action, etc., etc. The authors then go into strategies to avoid those decision traps. They tell you simply to be alert, be knowledgeable, and stop to think about what it is that you're dealing with. Those are simply the strategies that you'll use to avoid decision traps are these three things. So make sure that you look at that and understand what it is that the author's talking about. And last but not least, the author talks about your awareness of what's called the zombie project. Zombie projects were once active efforts that have died, been resurrected, and now drag on without a clear direction. These are projects that sap resources such as money, time, and personnel, and energy, but they continue despite thorough and convincing reports that they cost too much, are impractical, and have not delivered on their initial goals. So there are projects that fall into this category of zombie projects, which may be research studies or something that are considered to be unethical, may be unwise to go down a certain road to find out if something's happening that really is an ethical dilemma for you to be involved in, particularly if you're talking about patients and being involved with human subjects. So as you go through Chapter 7, try to remember these points. Ethical decision-making is a rational step-by-step process that promotes ethical outcomes. Remember that ethical decision-making is a process that can be learned. Be aware that routine decisions or small actions by healthcare managers can have significant ethical implications that often go unrecognized. Be aware that ethical decision-makers explicitly consider the right thing to do, the impact their decisions will have on others, and the consequences of their decisions. And lastly, healthcare managers can avoid decision traps or common errors by being alert to their existence, being knowledgeable about them, and stopping to think about what it is that you're dealing with and what you're going to do. So in a nutshell, that's what you're going to read about in Chapter 7. So to bring this full circle and get an understanding of when dealing with human subjects, we have got a real bad history in the United States when we're talking about research and healthcare organizations and how we have treated human subjects in the past. And so you need to be aware that when you're talking about research and healthcare organizations, there are a lot of studies that have been done in the past that we are well aware of and have been documented. You can read about in Chapter 8. And these are things that you should try to remember and grasp onto, because they are things that you're going to be hearing about for your entire career, because people will be talking about them in all kinds of forums and meetings and using them as examples of where ethical decision-making has led people down the wrong path, and maybe they have become morally bankrupt to the point where they didn't recognize that something was being done that was incorrect. When dealing with human subjects and ethical decision-making relative to conducting research, this is a very important chapter for you to understand everything that they're talking about. So let's take a look at the objectives of Chapter 8. Be familiar with frequently cited cases of breaches of ethics in the U.S. biomedical research. This chapter is going to talk about a lot of them. Be able to summarize key documents that underpin current ethical perspectives and regulations. Be able to outline the responsibilities of institutional review boards, or IRBs, and be able to explain the roles of federal agencies that are responsible for the oversight of research conducted in healthcare organizations. Now again, in this chapter, as you have had in previous chapters, there's a case from the field called Unethical United States Public Health Service Studies. And what it does is it talks about initiating discussion of ethical principles that should underlie research, provides concrete examples of researchers' unethical actions, and what they do is they describe in this U.S. Public Health Service study a couple of the studies that are just absolutely ridiculous when you read about them as to how people could decide that this was something that was appropriate to be done. And one of them is the Tuskegee Sexually Transmitted Disease Study, and also the Sexually Transmitted Disease Inoculation Study. These are two very famous cases that are wrought with unethical actions that brought the U.S. biomedical research teams to their knees, because it was realized that there were just so many things that were happening that were wrong that we kind of had to take 10 steps back and start to develop criteria relative to ethical decision-making and why these are healthcare ethical problems. They also will go into in this chapter, unethical human experimentations in U.S. healthcare, I talk about the Willowbrook hepatitis study, the Jewish chronic disease hospital study, the Fernald school study, and the Rentham state school study. This is where researchers and administrators showed a willingness to take advantage of vulnerable populations. They deceived patients and their families. They violated human rights and patient rights. They ignored obtaining patients' informed consent before they did anything to them or with them. They conducted experiments of non-therapeutic value to patients, and they performed experiments in which risks outweighed potential benefits for patients. So these are all very important studies that you want to spend some serious time reading and understand that what these things did was they led to major documents that now detail ethical research standards in healthcare. Some of those things that you're going to read about in this chapter are the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, Policy and Procedure Order 129, the National Research Act and subsequent regulations, and the Belmont Report. All of these are extremely important major documentations that detail ethical research standards in healthcare as a result of all the wrongdoing that was done, as I just talked about in the previous slide. You're going to talk about, and not the least of which, the Belmont Report, 3 ethical principles that are going to be talked about here are probably the most important things, because the principles are going to be talked about are respect for persons, the topic of beneficence, and the topic of justice. And when you talk about describing what these things are, these principles, when you talk about respect for persons, this is where we have to have, we talk about individuals should be treated as autonomous agents. They need to be treated individually as people who have rights. And more importantly, if we are dealing with persons with diminished autonomy, they are really entitled to protection. We're talking about people who maybe have that are mentally challenged or can't protect themselves because of their mental status. We want to make sure that we really pay respect to those types of people. And the way that we do this is by using the processes such as informed consent. Anytime we deal with anything that's ethically challenging within doing research with patients, you've got to get people to sign an informed consent, making sure that you've taken the time to explain to them everything that it is that they're going to be involved with and what it entails. The subjects are the requirements for that informed consent must be to the degree that they are, this informed consent is going to help you to decide in your own mind that these people are capable of making a decision. They must be able to be given the opportunity to choose what they shall or shall not happen to them, what part they're going to participate in. And this involves giving them all the information that is available, be comprehensive and voluntariness, make it plain to them that they can't comprehend everything that's going to be done to them, and therefore they need to know that their voluntarism can be stopped by them at any time. And then the other principle of beneficence. This is where we take the vow to do no harm. We maximize possible benefits and minimize possible harms. This is where the application of this principle is where we assess risks and benefits. And the requirements to do this is that we must present a nature and scope of risks and benefits that are carefully and systematically assessed and presented to the people that we're going to be doing research with and on. And then last but not least, the last principle is that of justice. This is where fair distribution of risks and benefits of research are going to be brought to the forefront, and we need to let our subjects, our human subjects, know that the selection of them is being done in a fair and just way. The process of informed consent is going to help us to do that and allow them respect as an individual person. And the reason that this is important because these requirements lay out procedures and outcomes in the selection of research subjects that specifically tell us what we've got to do to be able to treat people fairly and with the letter of the law. This chapter also is going to introduce you to the term IRB, or Institutional Review Board. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the IRB, but all organizations that deal with potential research of any kind with anybody for any reason, including organizations like ours, our university, they all have an IRB. And the IRB is not one single government entity that controls everything. And the IRB, an institutional review board, is an administrative body that's established by an organization for the purposes of protecting the rights and welfare of human subjects that are recruited to participate in research activities. So, universities have IRBs, hospitals have IRBs, government agencies have IRBs. There are IRBs everywhere. It is not just one single entity that is run by a group of people for one purpose. But one thing that you will learn about IRBs is that they must have and contain diverse members. In other words, it's got to have people with different perspectives about what's going to be done in research relative to human subjects. When you convene an IRB, there have to be meetings and minutes that are kept as a course of law. And IRBs are ruled by what is called common rule, where research that is reviewed, approved by an IRB, and research subject continuing review is subject to what's called common rule. This is something that's been established in the law that tells them that there are certain things that have to be done as an IRB when dealing with human subjects relative to research activities that must be done. You have to lay it all out in a certain way relative to common rule. And you'll talk about what that is in this chapter. And lastly, IRBs have the authority to terminate, to suspend research, and ultimately they are the ones that are responsible for the organization that established the IRB to make sure that people that are researchers are doing things right and in accordance with the law, and more above it all, doing it ethically. But be aware of the fact that some federal agencies that conduct research on a regular and ongoing basis are the Office of Human Research Protections, the Office of Research Integrity, and the Office for Civil Rights. These are people that actually conduct research and therefore have developed a lot of compliance guidance that can be used by other IRBs. So read about those research agencies, these federal agencies in this chapter to get an understanding of why they are important. Lastly, in this chapter 8, there's a mini case study called Groupthink and the Tuskegee Study. They're going to ask you 5 different questions that are pertinent to the Tuskegee Study that are intended to get you to be thinking about, well, why did these researchers do what they did? Why did they make all these mistakes? And how can, more importantly, how can we avoid them in the future? What's the right way to do these things? So, the points to remember in summary of Chapter 8 is U.S. biomedical researchers have conducted experiments on several categories of vulnerable human beings. Therefore, we must be aware that as far as ethics is concerned, we need to know that there are a lot of key documents and commonly cited examples of notorious human experiments that have been done out there, such as the Tuskegee Study and others. And they have been written up in key documents that underpin what we now refer to as our ethical perspectives. Those you can find in things like the National Research Act, the Belmont Report, and the Common Rule. Don't forget that an IRB, the Institutional Review Board, is an administrative body established to protect the rights and welfare of human subjects' research. Several past cases of research misconduct resulted in federal regulation over research integrity, but such misconduct continues today, and that's why we continue to teach this type of information. Be aware of HIPAA, the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act, which requires that researchers obtain a signed authorization before using or disclosing protected health information for research. And lastly, federal agencies exist to enforce the rules and regulations protecting the rights and welfare of research subjects and their research integrity. So I think that after you read all 3 chapters and you participate in the discussion board this week and answer the discussion board question, you take a look at, read a lot of these reports. I really would encourage you to spend a lot of time studying this information because it's very, very interesting and will give you a very well-rounded perspective of why healthcare ethics is such an important topic to study as a healthcare manager and why you're here studying it today. So with that, that's all the information I've got for you for week 3. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you know how to get in touch with me, and several of you have been doing that via email I haven't received any phone calls yet from anybody, but I've gotten lots of emails from people to clarify some of the information in the course. So don't be a stranger. If you need my assistance, that's why I'm here. Make sure you contact me, and I'll try to put you on the right path. So have a good week, and I will see you in week 4. Bye-bye.